Grüß, willkommen in einem Fragens video. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 2 of my Star Trek TOS timeline series of videos. In this video, I will be covering the period from 1 AD to 2000 AD, which covers the timeline up to the invention of warp, as well as lots of global wars. To assist viewers to verify if my timeline interpretation is correct, I provide information which can allow viewers to identify the episode the critical information is contained in. A full description of this information is found in part 1 of this video series, but this key should be adequate. When Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek back in 1966, he had a vision which remained basically consistent over the following 3 years. The animated series and early movies retained this consistency in the most part. When The Next Generation was released in 1987, Gene's vision had changed and the past needed to change in order to be consistent with this new vision. This video series will look at the original vision of Star Trek. In the episode Amok Time, we learn Spock's family held its land for over 2,000 years, which is earlier than 264 BC. He must have come from a very important family, or perhaps this is common due to longevity. If so, the birth rate is probably very low in Vulcan society. This date is even before Surak was born, which occurred between 300 and 399 AD. So this must be a very old family reaching back into the times of war and emotion on Vulcan. Beta Portillion is a system which contained an ancient civilization which was destroyed by a single-celled alien creature, or horde of them. It was the first of the 3 known civilizations which were destroyed in this manner. Federation archaeologists had conducted some investigation of the civilization. The date it was destroyed is unknown, but it was possibly at least 2,000 years ago, perhaps in 264 AD. I only use this date because we would normally only refer to a civilization as ancient if it was like Roman era or earlier. The other option is it occurred in 1964, which was 100 years prior to the next target civilization destroyed by this creature, or creatures. I'm assuming the little critters were moving at sublight speed between systems, so it probably took 100 years to get to the next target. However, I think the word ancient should be considered, and it's probably a lot older than 1964. Surak is the father of Vulcan, obviously a pacifist, and we think lived during the 4th century. While not contained in this episode, Memory Alpha claims Surak lived in the 4th century, which I assume is Earth century. This is sometime between 300 and 399 AD. As Vulcans lived for a long time, I can assume he was born in 300 AD and lived through the entire century. While this time frame of 1,966 years, possibly a bit less, may seem like a long time, it only represents about 19 to 20 generation for a Vulcan. A good question is, when did the Romulans leave Vulcan? I would assume it would have occurred during the period of war in order to allow all records to be lost, basically in the time of Surak or just before. If the Romulans had a primitive space drive, which took many years to arrive at Romulus, they could have arrived there in, let's say, 400 AD. This gave the Romulans about 1,600 years to colonise and populate their primary planet and start expanding into space, meeting the Terran expansion, which, as we know, resulted in war. While this theory is a stretch, in order to work, I have to assume the lifespan of the Romulans are less than those of the Vulcans. Perhaps the long travel in radiation-filled space affected their lifespan. To populate Romulus in 1,600 years would take a much shorter lifespan, unless, of course, Romulan women acted as baby machines, which I seriously doubt. The Metron, which showed itself to Kirk in Arena, was born in 764 AD. We are unsure how old the actual race is, but it must be a lot older than this date. Zetar is an alien non-Federation planet which was destroyed a millennium ago, 1,000 years I expect. So this was in 1266 AD. Eminar 7 started colonising Vendikar, possibly about 1564. After this, Vendikar becomes independent and starts a war with Eminar in 1764. The war raged until 2264, which is a very long war. In The Savage Curtain, we learn the Klingon founding father was Kahless the Unforgettable, which set the pattern for Klingon tyrannies. While not contained in this episode, Memory Alpha claims he first united the Klingons in the 9th century, which I assume is Earth century, which is sometime between 800 and 899 AD. I seriously doubt this is correct. The memory alpha theory is interesting, and there may have been a different Kahless which united a medieval technological level version of the Klingons back in this period. The big issue with assuming he's the person who actually set the tyrannies of the Klingon or current Klingon empire is that the Kahless that we see in this episode has a modern uniform which resembles a modern Klingon military uniform. The other issue is the 9th century is more than 1400 years ago. It would be like saying that Justinian's attempt to reunify the Roman Empire set the pattern of all Western civilization, and this is simply not reasonable. As the Klingons were a stand-in for the Soviets, Kahless is closer to a Lenin, Stalin or Mao, who set the pattern of their respective totalitarian civilizations and unified their people and started expanding out. A good analogy would be if, let's say, Trotsky was the leader of the USSR, and he managed to conquer the world, which was actually his desire to do so. The Klingons needed to have expanded into space about the same time as the Romulans and Terrans to allow them to be equal to those nations, confederations or empires. As a result, linking Kahless to Lenin in 1919-1920 could work. This gives Kahless 80 years to unify his world, and then his successor then sallies out to create the Klingon Empire, retaining the tyrannical form of government that Kahless initially created. In The City on the Edge of Forever, McCoy managed to change the timeline when he went through the time gate, but Kirk and the landing party around the time gate remains unchanged. Thus, they were able to go back and correct the error. If McCoy caused a split in the timeline, Kirk and Spock may have ended up in the new timeline, but perhaps being close to the time gate clearly must have protected them. Regardless, time travel is complex business and should be avoided at all costs. I know this is not part of the TOS universe, but as it does not affect the timeline, and I really like the T'Pol character, I cannot resist. In 1957, the vessel that Tamir was serving on was investigating the first artificial satellite launched by humans, then a pre-warp civilization, Sputnik 1. A mishap with their impulse manifold forces the craft to crash land in Pennsylvania. The captain is killed and Tamir is second in command, takes charge. A distress signal is sent, but after more than 2 weeks, no reply is received. From fear of starvation, Mestral and Tamir enter the nearby town of Carbon Creek, Pennsylvania. Over the next few months, the Vulcans successfully integrate themselves with the townsfolk, renting an apartment from Maggie, a tavern owner. Tamir was T'Pol's second foremother or great-grandmother, and Telez's foremother, grandmother. While the events in the Enterprise series only superficially resemble that in the TOS universe or timeline, this event could have occurred in both timelines. I would like to believe T'Pol is out there somewhere in the TOS timeline. Civilization on Earth 2 collapsed 300 years prior to the Enterprise visiting it in episode Miri, which must be 1964. This could be used to date Kirk's 5-year mission, assuming Earth 2 collapsed the year Star Trek was released in 1966. If correct, the year Kirk discovered the planet was 2266. This is 2 years later than the years I am using. We'll never have an exact idea of the dates of the 5-year mission, so all dates could be expected to have an error margin. This is pretty close to Akuta's estimate, which is what I normally use, and I wonder if he used that source to derive it. Earth 2, as described in the episode Miri, shows us another way humanoids may have spread around the galaxy, pure probability. I doubt this has any reasonable chance of occurring more than once. Actually, occurring even once is pretty unlikely. The Andromeda galaxy is dominated by the Kelvan Empire, which then sent an expedition to the Milky Way. They may have left 300 years ago or in 1965. This is based on the estimated length or time to go back. An interesting coincidence if it is, because that's pretty close to the date that Star Trek started. The alien race is very unlike humans, so it probably has nothing to do with the civilization destroyed 500,000 years ago by some type of supernova. Perhaps the supernova, which blew up 500,000 years ago, had something to do with the rising radiation, which was causing the Kelvin Empire so much trouble, and was the reason why they decided to send an expedition to the Milky Way. I doubt it, but you never know. In the episode Turnabout Intruder, we discover another Federation research facility exploring a long-dead civilization. The planet is called Camus Two. When it collapsed, is not mentioned, neither the reason why. There is a functioning machine and the ruins don't look that old, so something may have killed the civilization slowly, with the last inhabitants dying only a few hundred years prior. Perhaps this machine was critical in keeping the survivors alive. My wild guess is this civilization may have collapsed 300 years ago, about 1966. This could be totally wrong, and we may have many examples, and we do have many examples of functioning machines from dead civilizations which are older, but it's my guess, and that's what I'm sticking with at the present moment until I can find additional evidence to suggest otherwise. In the episode Assignment Earth, the Enterprise goes back to 1968 to do a historical study when it intercepts Gary 7, an alien-trained Earthman who is tasked with preventing World War III. I suspect Gary is the event which split the timeline from the TOS timeline and TNG timeline by basically preventing World War III. I suspect the aliens which assisted Gary are the Preservers, which in turn could be an offshoot of the Telosian. One theory I have is that if the Enterprise wasn't there to intercept Gary, perhaps the transmission goes wrong and Gary dies. Thus, he's unable to stop World War III. Because the Enterprise intercepts him, they actually save his life, and he goes on preventing World War III, destroying the TOS timeline, and creating the timeline that at least we live in at the present moment. In Tomorrow Is Yesterday, the Enterprise goes back to Earth in the year 1969, not intentionally, but accidentally. I originally thought this event may have caused the timeline divergence from our own timeline. However, now I believe it was Gary 7 which caused the time split, as he was the one who almost certainly stopped World War III. In the TOS timeline, World War III occurred in the gap between the moon landing and the Eugenics War. This is a primary and pivotal event which caused our timeline to diverge from the timeline, the Star Trek timeline. World War III probably lasts for about, let's say, 4 years and only involves a limited nuclear exchange. Anything else would end the Star Trek series permanently. It probably only involved the major powers in Europe, as most of the rest of the world needed to be free of major power forces to allow the genetically altered supermen to take over. The most likely scenario is a Soviet attack in Europe, which uses chemical weapons. In desperation, NATO uses tactical nuclear weapons to halt the advance and then pushes the Soviets back to their start line. To create a death toll of 37 million, it's likely only cities in Germany and surrounding countries were subject to nuclear attack. World War III weakens the First and Second World, allowing the genetically altered supermen to take over the non-aligned world. It may also have caused communism to fall in the USSR and instigated the seed for a final united Earth to emerge. It's likely in the Eugenics War the weakened superpowers joined together. It must be noted, while there was a World War III, the US specifically still had the resources to develop the DY-100 class spacecraft and use it for exploration during this 20-year period. So it didn't impact the US economy or ability to advance its technology to any great extent. If we go back to the movie The First Contact, you'll quickly probably notice that my scenario doesn't match the scenario presented in that particular movie. Now, in The First Contact, 600 million people were killed. As First Contact's Enterprise most likely arrived during the Eugenics War, not World War III, a body count of 600 million could very well be viable. This is another fact which indicates this is when that particular Enterprise actually arrived, rather than during a period the United Earth was united. Mars was colonised and probably independent, and Earth already colonised at least one other planet in another system. None of these events were indicated in the First Contact movie. Now, sometime between 1990 and 1996, the DY-100 class spacecraft were built. The SS Botany Bay was a DY-100 class spacecraft. We know that there is a DY-500 class as well, and possibly classes between these two values. The DY-100 class was built between 1990 and 1996 and was designed for interplanetary travel only. The DY-500 was probably designed for interstellar travel, which is why Kirk first assumed it was a DY-500. As the first Earth-Saturn probe occurred in 2009, it used the DY-100 class spacecraft, most likely a later version, possibly DY-200, DY-300 or DY-400. The specific DY-100 used by Khan was modified to allow it to conduct interstellar travel. We discover later this was an emergency, and this may have been the first interstellar Earth ship ever launched from our system. It's also possible this was an older ship purchased by Khan from the US before he was involved in the Eugenics War. Kirk seems to imply this ship class was superseded in 2018, which could be related to its engines. The DY-100 used atomic engines, while in 2018 ships were built which could travel between systems, possibly due to the invention of an early version of impulse drive. Perhaps the DY-500 was the first class of ship built in 2018, which first used this early impulse drive. The last of the genetically altered dictators was Khan Singh, who controlled a quarter of the Earth at its maximum. Its logical sin was centred in India and expanded west into the Middle East and east into Asia proper. It's unlikely to have included China, Russia or Europe, but may have included everything between Egypt and Vietnam. Singh took power in 1992, probably in India, and may well have taken over many of his fellow supermen to the east and west. It's likely they peacefully joined him when they saw the other supermen fall to the major powers. Once the other supermen were removed, the remaining major powers attacked Singh. In 1993, a number of genetically altered supermen took over 40 countries and began to fight among themselves. The 40 countries were most likely non-allied countries which were not involved in World War III. Khan was the exception, as he had already taken over a country the year before. Perhaps his father was the leader of India and he just took it over from him when he passed away. During 1993 to 1994, the major powers retook a number of the countries controlled by the genetically altered supermen, most likely in South America and Africa. The remaining genetically altered supermen, after seeing this, quickly joined Khan. Khan purchases or steals the DY-100 class spacecraft because he knows he will almost certainly be the next target. It's clear that at this point in time, the major powers had probably united. They'd united in the face of the genetically altered supermen taking over a whole bunch of countries. They were probably worried about this, and they decided to take out the genetically altered supermen. Perhaps one of them had done something stupid like attack, maybe America or one of the other major powers. We'll never really know for certain. Khan, the remaining genetically altered superman, was finally attacked in 1995 and defeated in a 2-year campaign. Khan and his followers escaped in the DY-100 sleeper ship. Most likely this was an older DY-100 purchased from the US when it was at peace, specifically to act as an emergency escape vessel in case Khan lost. Khan could have even stolen it, which may have triggered the final war. Assuming this ship could reach half the speed of light, which is a real stretch, and it was travelling for 268 years, it could have travelled no more than 134 light years. More likely, and still a stretch, it was probably half that distance from Earth. I will attempt to fit the events of the First Contact movie into this early history of Earth. As the stated year in First Contact and the involvement of the Enterprise crews in the development of warp drive simply cannot be correct based on the TOS episodes. The First Contact Enterprise may have appeared at the end of the Eugenics War, discovered that the Botany Bay was a key factor in the Vulcans discovering Earth and giving Earth the incentive to expand into space. The movie pretty much would run as it did, except it was to help the genetically altered supermen to launch the first interstellar sleeper ship, and the Borg attempts to stop this. The sleeper ship launch was the event which makes the Vulcans, probably Vulcan traders, notice Earth. This is a complete guess by myself, but to make First Contact possible, that's First Contact between Vulcans and Earth, the following sequence of events could have occurred. Because the Botany Bay is launched into interstellar space, a Vulcan ship notices it, traces it back to its origin, and makes first contact with Earth. This could have been later than 1997, but 1997 is the earliest probable date of Vulcan-Earth first contact, and the date that I'll go with. We know that Vulcan traders are common, so the first contact may have been Vulcan traders. In this scenario, the Vulcans are using impulse drive. Because Earth meets the Vulcans and sees impulse drives and discovers it's possible to travel between the stars, Earth, trying to recover from the eugenics wars, decides to focus on expanding into space and start developing the impulse drive because they discover there are actual alien civilizations out there. They direct their energies as expanding into space rather than fighting among themselves. This makes sense as all wars have at their root the desire to increase available resources to support increased population. Instead of taking it from other countries, Earth now can get the resources to support its growing population from other planets. I also suspect Earth was probably very tired of fighting among itself at this particular point in time, and any option to avoid this was grabbed with glee. Finally, Earth probably saw there were alien races out there, and as they'd had a pretty bad experience with major wars, they probably assumed that they may be the target of a hostile alien at some point, so they needed to get out there really quickly. And so with great sadness we come to an end of my part 2 of my Star Trek TOS series timeline video, in this case covering everything from 1 AD to 2000 AD. The episode scripts can be found using the URL shown. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.